So we have to do an update of what's been going on in Ukraine because honestly, now really does seem that the pressure is actually being put on Putin where it should have been put so long ago. So you may have been hearing, of course, that the Ukrainians have signed this minerals deal. Now, let's be clear: this is not the original minerals deal that, if you may remember, what Zelensky and Trump were due to sign, and it all ended very badly when, of course, J.D. Vance accused him of not dressing properly for the occasion. You know, that very embarrassing White House interview for, the president of the United States. Everyone looked at that and just went, what the? um, But things have changed significantly, very, very significantly. And it really does look like that actually America might actually finally be in Ukraine's corner, where it should be all along. And this new minerals deal, massive step down from where it originally was. The US doesn't get to control all those minerals like a colony, potentially even stopping maybe its ascension to the EU under this new deal. They don't get to do that. It acts as more an investment fund. And of course, the US says, well, if you all want to join the EU, we will then accept European regulations, which is a massive climb down from the deal that, of course, Trump originally wanted Zelensky to sign. So, hey, it's an improvement. However, still worth, keeping your fingers crossed and keeping an eye on what's going on here, because as Trump has shown, he could just go any way he wants in any direction. But for the moment, it is now the pressure on Putin. So we're going to go into this and some of the stuff that's changed, and quite frankly, the diplomatic work, the legwork that has been put into this, not only by Emmanuel Macron, but also Keir Starmer as well, which I think should absolutely be recognized. I know Starmer has been getting a lot of stuff about offering him that, that state visit. But I'll tell you what, by the sounds of it, that state visit helped this along. So before we do get on into this, please do remember to click on the Patreon page, the Buy Me Coffee link, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there is the Pony Club down below. You can also hit the like, hit the share button as well. And of course, we'll crack on then into this, coming from the Telegraph, talking about this, with the title of, the tables have now turned and Putin's Russia is now in dire trouble. Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron have together pulled off a very remarkable high feat of statecraft. They may have now averted a strategic debacle over the First Order in Ukraine, and with it, the irreparable damage now to the credibility of the West. This long-fraught US-Ukraine minerals deal signed in Washington, actually a shale gas deal, is a radically different document from what Donald Trump originally demanded for $350 billion of war debt reparations to the US and the colonial takeover of the country's infrastructure. So, like I say, and I said at the beginning of this, massive climb down to what is just, it's a shale gas deal. massive, massive climb down. So the full story of Trump's Damascus conversion will, of course, emerge over time. But Ukrainian officials say the British and the French leaders played a very critical role in steering the US president away from his pro-Kremlin infatuation, as did Boris Johnson. And again, Boris Johnson, once again, coming out from nowhere and going, well, hey, if the man does good work, then, hey, you got to praise it, right? It feels weird praising Boris Johnson, but hey, broken clock, right? Twice a day, right? It was, of course, all this very patient whispering that then paved the way for the Trump-Zelensky tete-a-tete on the marble floors of St. Peter's in Rome. Jonathan Powell, Downing Street's unflappable national security advisor, will very well deserve his knighthood when the time comes, and something even more than a bachelor grade if this is indeed now the turning point after weeks of diplomatic calamities. The tables have, of course, finally turned, and it is suddenly Vladimir Putin who is in trouble, trying to hold together now an exhausted war economy as the price of the Ural crude crashes to $56 a barrel from $77 in mid-January, as now the global economic downturn tips the whole commodity complex into a cascading bear market. The spot price of liquefied natural gas in Asia has fallen to 30% over just 2 months. It comes now as China is trying to now charm Europe, urgently now seeking to prevent any EU moves to try and now raise its own barriers against a diversionary flood of Chinese exports to now shut out America. Xi Jinping may now have to dial down his no-limits friendship with Putin to reduce now his covert help for Russia's war, if now he wants a very serious hearing. But of course, this mineral accord remains a very bitter pill for Kyiv to swallow. At least, of course, its plausibility and compatibility with the Ukraine constitution does not, of course, obstruct the EU membership. Deputy Prime Minister Yulia Sakello says that Ukraine now retains full ownership of all resources on our territory. And like I say, what a massive come down this was from the original insane deal. What a massive come down on this. Ukraine will also be able to purchase US weapons on a quasi-lend-lease basis. The first of the 50 million tranche of military support was approved last night. And again, a lot of the Biden-era weapons deals were coming to an end this year. To the fact that now there are more US weapons deals, more of this lend-lease stuff going on to Ukraine, that is good. But the debt clock will obviously start ticking from today, wiping, of course, the slate clean on the $121 billion in total now American aid since the war began, most of which was, of course, spent on production within the US or even considered in the semi-obsolete inventory due to be scrapped. And I say, this is worth saying time and time again. This deal and all this stuff that America supplied went to, here's all this old, obsolete stuff that is going to be scrapped anyway. Why don't we just give it to the Ukrainians? At least they can use it. And guess what? We can spend all this money on building new stuff here to replenish that supply so it is not obsolete. It was a good deal that America was doing, but Trump could not see that. Neither side now will have a controlling vote over the investment fund. The US pledges now to help Ukraine mobilize capital via the Development Finance Corporation, the geopolitical arm of the US Treasury and Commerce Department. This opens now a way for a serious flood of investments in shale gas and resources to the Yuzhka field. As reported earlier this month, an international study by Ukrainian experts concluded that on a carbon ratio, prosperity and thickness match, of course, the best now of shale US gas basins in Malchus and Permin. We could replace almost half the loss of the Russian gas exports to Europe, said Alexander Kovary, the head of Ukraine's energy giant Naftogaz. So Russia can kiss goodbye to its European gas market forever. Again, that will be good. Ukrainian pipeline gas and American LNG will suffice. Hey, that happens. If we can get that flowing into Europe, that will be good. Because again, Russia will lose its stranglehold it had over the European market when it comes to gas. Scott Bent, the US Treasury expert, warned, of course, Putin will, of course, deal committed to Washington now to a peace process centered on a free, sovereign, and prosperous Ukraine. One, of course, never knows quite when to believe when Trump administration actually speaks. But the Kremlin has clearly now overplayed its hand, miscalculating how far it could push its maximalist demands and how long it could keep striding along and picking now an impatient US president. Republican Senator and Trump golf partner Lindsey Graham is also now going for the jugular. He may have soon a veto-proof 67% votes of Senate for the legislation that imposes a 500% punitive tariff on any country that buys Russian energy or even strategic materials. That will be crippling, because then who is going to buy Russian energy when you are now could end up facing a 500% tariff? So, if the Kremlin, of course, refuses to negotiate a peace agreement or even violates a peace agreement or invades Ukraine again out in the future, Russia's, of course, hot Keynesian war machine is now in the very same state of exhaustion as the Imperial German war machine back in 1917. And I have kept on talking about this, that Germany, that Russia has ended up in exactly that same state. Their army's in that same state, all that kind of stuff. Go look it up. I don't have time to to talk about that, but oh boy, they could be in a massive bad situation for the Russian economy. Even if all these sanctions get lifted, what happened to the Weimar Republic had to deal with massive hyperinflation. There's going to be a lot of problems that Putin isn't going to be able to solve. So Germany had, of course, managed to be able to preserve something very close to at least a normal civilian economy over the years of the First World War, but the Allied blockade, the chronic shortages, the lack of manpower, and the money eventually forced the military to take over whole productive apparatus. That too then failed and ultimately incubated the Weimar hyperinflation. Russia has now depleted the liquid and usable reserves of its rainy day fund. Military spending now almost certainly exceeds 10% of its GDP in one way or another, and is being funded by off the books coercing now the banks to lend it something more than $250 billion to defense contractors, sewing up a crisis now in the banking system. So, as I said, bad things are going to happen. Even after this war, whatever happens, Russia is going to get screwed massively. So, this is, of course, what Anton Sugyov, Russia's finance minister, was, of course, referring to this week when he advised the Russians now to read Nergoz's Dead Souls and Anton Chigurh's Cherry Orchard. It is the first, of course, about fraudulent finance. Second, about, of course, crippling debts. He has already introduced a string of new taxes just this year, and he is now trying to draw on fresh emergency measures. The trade-off now between guns and butter can be postponed no more. Serious austerity is now coming for the first time since Putin launched his fatal misadventure. Russia is no longer the proverbial petrol station masquerading as a country, but it now relies on raw material exports to fund a quarter of its budget. Oil exports from the war. Krillin Balkin, its BCS, says that higher US and UK sanctions on Russia's shadow fleet, Biden's parting shot, may have now punched the discount on Urals crude to around $15. This, of course, lowers the de facto market of which Russian crude oil then exports to, of course, $45. Another big drop from there, which may well happen as Saudi Arabia now keeps adding barrels to an ever supplied market. This would now make it extremely harder for Russia to keep prosecuting the war beyond the summer. We can but hope that is the case. I hope that's the case, that their economy has just finally reached the end of its tether. I've said this before, and I've said I've hoped maybe this is the end of the year, but hey, fingers crossed, right? If it ends in the summer, great. The now latest Russian offensive has now largely petered out, and now at terrible human cost. Russia is not close to now conquering the 4 oblasts it so previously annexed. With the movements now on the map are so tiny, they have nothing of strategic value. Ukraine is now big enough to trade time for space, and as a Western military, said a Western military expert on the ground. So Ukraine can now afford to lose territory because it is so big but because Russia just does not have the time. The Ukrainians can take back lost territory, but they're not going to get rolled over either. This has now come down to a war of economic attrition. This is what happened in the Russian rear. They will now decide this. Trump, of course, may change his mind again, which we'll have to watch out for. And of course, the mineral deal does not give Ukraine any bankable security guarantees. Europe is, of course, very fractious and wary, but the balance of probability is that Vladimir Putin will now fail to turn Ukraine into now a castrated vassal state along the lines of Belarus. He may, of course, keep some of the land he currently holds and win the legal recognition of Crimea. But at least from Washington, be it if the far-right ultranationalist hawks in Russia compel him to hold out for a total victory, he may not even be able to keep that up. So, yeah. I mean, that's just look at the line there on that Urals crude. Just look at it crash. So we'll find out, as it said, over time, what the full diplomatic situation was, how this came about, and what happened. But we probably have had quite a miracle in the Vatican. And for once, since Donald Trump's taken office, in Ukraine's favor. And oh boy, if that vote passes about putting, you're still buying Russian energy resources, here's a 500% tariff. Oh boy. Not only, as we said that, you've got Saudi Arabia just pumping out more and more oil into an already saturated market. Things cannot continue this way for Russia. Sooner or later, something will have to give. It will happen in the back lines. It's just when, what it will be. It could be the tiniest thing that ends up, a pebble, rolling down the hill that turns into an eventual avalanche. What that will be, who knows? But it will be some sort of economic crisis that could cause Russia's massive collapse and end this war. And hey, as it was said there, that after summer, we can but hope. We can but hope that is the case. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.